So today we're actually looking at an alternative version to post4, a question which I'm actually going to post here. I'm going to copy paste it. So I think it's lagging on me a bit, but I copy pasted it here. So post4, I mean, we've already done this in a previous video, and I think I made a link where we actually did this particular problem. But I would say that that wasn't as intuitive as I think the solution that we're going to cover now. So if you're not familiar with post4 in codingBat, I mean, you could read the problem description, but essentially what this is asking you to do is it's saying that, okay, in an array like the array we have here, in an array, it wants you essentially to go through the array. So we would use some type of traversion, right? Maybe by a for loop. And essentially what we would do is we would look at, we would try to search for a for, and we would want all the elements, we would want all the elements which come after that for. And so here we have 1 and 2, because of course, after the for, you have these elements. Now, the tricky thing is when you have 2 elements, and that's when the specification of the problem actually becomes relevant. And the specification is important because when you have 2 fors, it only wants you to essentially copy the elements after the last for in the array. Now, that isn't to say the last for being a for which is at the end of the array in the sense that it's the last element, but the last for in the sense that as you look through the array, you're going to have multiple fors, but you only want to start looking, or actually you only want to start noting down the numbers which are after the latest for. So here, in this case, we don't return these numbers, even though of course these numbers follow a for. We actually return these numbers because these numbers are after the latest for, the last for in the array. And I mean, that's where the complexity would come, right, a little bit. And what I thought to do, essentially, this was the gist, was instead of actually looking at the array, the problem of, at the heart of the problem was, first, how do I catch the last for, right? So instead of going through the array from left to right and then judging a for, I say, okay, if nums of I, and that's of course any given element referenced by its index, if nums of I is equal to 4, then I would have to have another decision, which would be, okay, iterate through the rest of the array elements and see if there's another for. And if there is, then make sure there is not a for after that. So instead of actually taking that approach, which is of course going from left to right, I instead thought, why not go from right to left, and whichever for came first, that would be the latest for. Doesn't matter what elements are before the latest for, even if it's a for, because I'm only concerned with the for which is essentially at the last, which is essentially the last for. I'm only concerned with all the elements which follow the last for. If you look here, we have this. We're not concerned with these elements. We're only concerned with the elements which follow the last for. And the same thing here. This is the first for. We're not concerned with these elements. We're really concerned with these elements because they follow the last for. And so I said, okay, let me not traverse the array from right to left, or actually, let me not traverse the array left to right. Let me instead traverse the array right to left. So I'd have a for loop, right? And so the standard for loop, which actually traverses from right to left, would essentially look something like this, right? Where your index is starting at 0. So if you had this array here, you're starting at 0, and then as you increment and you go to the rest of the array, I is continuously incremented by 1. And but the alternative here is to go from left to right. So we start from this point, which is nums.length, and we come here and we enter nums.length minus 1, which is of course the name of the array, which we don't actually have yet. So I'm actually going to have to put that array there. So this array is going to be called nums, int nums, right? Int nums is equal to, and I'm going to actually pick up a case. Let's say this case here. So we're essentially starting from the end of the array, which is here, And so int I starts from the index starts from this point, and then it moves its way down to the 0th index. So I is essentially greater than or equal to 0. So it's gonna gradually decrement, which is why I actually put the minus here. It's gonna gradually decrement its way down until I is equal to 0, and it's gonna start from the last element in the array. And doing so, I can then check if nums of I, if nums of I is equal to 4, then I'll go ahead and do something in here, right? Now, at the heart of the question, what do we want to do? Well, if we sense a 4, right, which brings us to this particular if statement, then we know that we don't want to keep iterating. We don't want to go through the array again. We have everything we need. So if we get a 4, then all we're concerned with is the 4, of course, and these elements which come after the 4. We're not concerned with anything before. So what we want to do is we want to have another for loop, which is going to essentially, we're going to have another array and of course another for loop, and that for loop will essentially paste all of this in that array. And so I'll kind of show you what I mean. Let me pull up. I know you can't see this, but I hope it's apparent now. So we're going through and we sensed a 4 at this point, and then we're going to have a for loop, right? We're going to have a for loop, and what that for loop is going to do, what that for loop is going to do is it's going to take a new array, right? It's going to take a new array and it's going to paste these elements inside that new array. And that way we would have a new array with only those elements which come after the first, the latest 4. So I'm going to make a new array here, and it's going to be called int. I'm just going to call this p. Actually, let me call it z. Is equal to new int, right? Or let me just call it array. Okay. Array is equal to new, and then we have a problem. And the problem there is, okay, we want an array which is going to give us all the elements which are after the latest 4, but we don't know the length of that array. What would the length of that array be? Well, the length of that array, and I'll show you this again in Paint, and let me actually pull this up. So the length of the array, so if we do sense of 4, what index is this at? So it's 0, 1, so this is at index 1, okay? And what is nums.length? Or actually, what index is this at, the last element in the array? Well, we know that the last element in the array is actually just, it's actually just nums.length minus 1. So we have this sort of connection, this relationship between the element that we're at and nums.length minus 1, which is equal to what? Well, in this case, it's equal to 1, 2, or actually, we start from 0, 0, 1, well, 0, 1, 2, 3, well, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So this is 4. So at the last element in the array is 4. Now, the crazy thing is if you minus this, which is nums.length minus 1, if you minus the index at which the last element resides, minus the element that we found the 4 at, which is 1, will essentially acquire 3. And 3 is the amount of elements that we need in the array. And this works for every problem set. So if we had 3 and then we had 4, 2, and then 1, we would essentially want these elements 2 and 1. Nums.length in this case, minus 1, of course, would be 0, 1, 2, 3, right? So that'd be 3. 3 minus where we found the 4, which is at 1. 3 minus 1 is 2. We want 2 elements, which is 2 and 1. And so that relationship here becomes a little apparent. So we will only know the length of the array once we find the 4 that we're concerned with. So let's actually just initialize it here to nothing. And then here, when we actually find the 4 that we want, we can say new int, or actually we would have to reference the name of the array. Array equals new int, and then we would have the length would be, well, like I said before, it's going to be nums.length minus 1. It's going to be the index at which the last element is at, minus the current index that we found the 4 at, which is I. So that's how we get the length of the array, right? But now, of course, we want to actually populate these elements into this new array that we have. And the way we do that is we're going to have a for loop, okay? We're going to have a for loop, and we can't name it I because I already exists in this block of code. So this for loop is going to take in another variable called maybe k, and we're going to set it equal to I because we're actually starting from where we found the 4. So here we found the 4 at the 1, so at the first index, which is actually the second element, 0, 1. And so we pick 1 off and we say, okay, we're starting at 1. And so we're actually starting at where we found the 4, which is I. So k should be less than nums.length. We're going to traverse the rest of the array, and we're going to increment I each time as we do that so that we can actually look at other values in the array. And so we're going to have, so array at a particular index, and this index is going to represent the count. This index is going to represent the count at which we can start for this array here, because we actually want to start populating from 0 onwards. So array at index is essentially going to be, well, essentially going to be nums of k. Okay, and as k increments, which we actually have to change here, as k increments, it's gonna keep populating the array at that particular index, and of course we want to increment index itself so that we can actually move on towards the end of the array. The quantity of the elements in the array, we want to increment index so that we can actually look at or populate a different index each time on each and every single iteration. So that's how we would actually populate the array. Now, an interesting thing here is that once we actually are able to find this pattern, the latest 4, and then all the elements after the latest 4, we actually want to break out after doing this process, after having populated, and we wouldn't break out here, we'd actually break out after the if is done. And that's of course because we don't want to break out after the first iteration. We want to actually break out after we've populated our array with the elements after the latest 4. And you'll actually see here that when I actually print out I is equal to 0, I is less than nums.length, I plus plus, when I actually print out, or actually we wouldn't do nums.length, we'd actually do array.length, right? Because that's the array that we want to print out. So this array that I'm supposedly going to return, if we print out the its elements, you'll actually see that it doesn't have everything we want, and I'll tell you why once I get this printed, of course. So first we get an array index out of bounds exception, it seems. I'm not too sure as to why that had occurred. Let's see. So we start at 0, I is less than array.length, and we're printing array of I. That doesn't seem to be too problematic. Index 3 out of bounds for length 3. So I guess there's a problem somewhere in the code, right? So I think this is because we're actually populating 4 elements in an array which should have 3 elements, if you think about it, because we start our for loop from where 4, essentially from the index at which 4 left off, right? So if you think about it, when we found this 4, we declared an array of the elements which are to the right of the 4. And then we had a for loop which actually populates that array with those elements, but we're not actually populating the array with those elements because our count, which is responsible for populating that array, starts from I, which is where we found that 4. And so it's actually populating this all of this in addition. And so it's actually populating this element, the 4, as well, in addition to all of this. So it's actually having 4 elements instead of 3. So what we could do here is we could actually just increment I by 1 so that when we do find the 4, we start populating from here instead of populating the entire. And I think when we do this, it shouldn't be problematic. And then you see that we have 1, 2, 3, which is of course the elements that we wanted. And I think if we take out the ln part, then it's not going to print them out in a vertical manner, rather in a horizontal manner. So we have 1, 2, 3. And I think if you mess around with this and you check, okay, let me have 5, 4, or 5, 3, 4, 5, 2, 6, 4, 5, 2, 1, 8, or 8, yeah, or 9, or 8, or 9. Well, what would we expect, right? So we're going from the left, right? We come from the left and we find the 4. We find the 4. Then we declare an array length of this many elements. Then we increment I by 1. So we're actually starting from here. And then we have an array which starts from here and populates the array with those elements. And after it does that, we break out and then we return those elements. Okay. So that's how essentially that would work. And that is identical to the code that we have here. And our array in this case is called post4. So this is another way of doing it, right? I mean, you could go about it several different ways. In fact, I think I don't think array2 even requires us to use nested for loops. I think that's more of an array3 thing, right? So there are definitely many ways of going about the problem, but this is, I would say, an intuitive approach that I felt. Now, if you actually if you look up, well, we could look up, what's the name of the question? Post4, right? So if you look up post4 Java solutions, it says, look, solving post4 with one loop. And you'll see that this person had 2 loops, right? It seems like he wrote somewhat redundant code, maybe. You can see that this person solved it with what seems to be 1 loop, right? So he had a 4, and then the result, an integer, he had a result. So the result is, so his array is called result, and he stores, it seems to be, the result stores the length or the elements which are after the 4. I think with the, and then he has another thing called j, which is equal to 0. And what that does is, otherwise, so, and then on the second iteration, he comes back again. He says if numbers, so I think he's doing it more of, I'm going to have to understand that later. In fact, I don't think I have the energy to, but this seems a little long, right? And this is pretty nice. This is nice. But he's used, I think, a collection here, a stream, as they call it, I think. So many different ways, many different ways. There is a more I think a more compact site. I think it's called Java Problem Solutions. Yeah. This one also has, again, I mean, it has these codingBat problem solutions, and it seems like this person has much of the same approach that we do, sort of. Return foo, int bar, new int, return bar. Wow, a lot of code here. Arrays.copy of range. It's a quick problem, quick solution. What if I only wanted to return only even numbers after 4? Geez, how would you do that? Well, seems like you would have to judge whether or not the number is even. So you'd say, okay, if nums of k, right, modulus 2, and actually I have to start sharing my screen again. Nums of k modulus 2 is equal to 0, then and only then would you store that index. And I think now if I run this 200, no idea what happened. So I guess those numbers, yeah, I think we'll get back to it later, but